He had been working the night shift for nearly 5 years, moving through the corridors of the naval facility with quiet precision. While most people only saw him as the janitor, sweeping floors and emptying trash cans, there was a sense about him that made people instinctively step aside when he walked past. It wasn't arrogance, or even a presence he tried to command. It was the calm certainty in his steps, the way his eyes scanned the room without seeming intrusive, like someone always aware of what was going on around him. Every night was the same. He arrived when the last of the daytime workers were leaving, put on his worn uniform, and started his rounds. He worked quickly, but there was care in everything he did. He didn't just clean the floors. He made sure everything looked neat, that nothing was out of place, that everything felt like it belonged where it should be. He'd been doing it for years, and he knew that even the smallest details mattered in a place like this. A dropped pen, a misplaced folder, or a forgotten chair could break the rhythm of the day shift, and he took pride in preventing that. Most people didn't notice him. That was exactly the way he liked it. He didn't come to this job for recognition. He came for stability, for the quiet routine that allowed him to provide for his child. Life hadn't been easy. He had become a single parent a few years back, after circumstances that left him responsible for raising a child on his own. Every morning, after finishing his night shift, he would drive home, sometimes exhausted to the bone, and make breakfast for a small, eager face waiting at the kitchen table. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Despite the long hours and the hard work, he didn't complain. He had learned long ago that complaining never changed anything. Life handed people challenges, and what mattered was how you met them. For him, the mop and bucket were part of the solution, a way to ensure his child had food on the table, a warm bed, and a sense of normalcy. He knew the sacrifices were worth it. Still, there were nights when the quiet corridors of the facility reminded him of what he used to do, of what he had once been. There were glimpses of it in his mannerisms, in the way he moved. He walked with a certain awareness, always alert, always scanning exits, entry points, the flow of the building. He had a posture that made people unconsciously notice him, though they couldn't quite place why. Sometimes he caught the gaze of a visitor or a high-ranking officer, and held it for just a moment longer than necessary. And in those seconds, something in them shifted. They felt he had seen more than he let on, though they couldn't explain it. Most nights were quiet, just him and the dim lights overhead. He would whistle softly as he worked, a tune that his child liked, letting it echo lightly down the empty hallways. He had grown to like the silence. It gave him time to think. He thought about the future, about how to balance his life, about the small victories that made each day worth it. Sometimes he thought about the past, though rarely aloud. The memories were sharp, but fleeting, tucked carefully away behind the kind of calm smile that never reached his eyes for long. It was during one of these quiet nights that the Admiral first noticed him. The Admiral was visiting the facility, inspecting every corner, every department, making notes, asking questions. He was a man used to attention, used to people reacting to his presence, but tonight something caught his eye. Among the staff moving about, there was the janitor. Something about him stood out. Perhaps it was the steady rhythm of his movements, or the way he carried himself without drawing attention, yet still commanded it. The Admiral found himself watching, curious, though he didn't yet know why. The janitor moved, as though he had a purpose for every motion. There was a rhythm to the way he cleaned, the way he adjusted chairs, straightened papers, wiped down surfaces. It was almost meditative, but there was a discipline there, a precision that went beyond mere habit. It was the discipline of someone who had been trained, someone who had seen things most people couldn't imagine. Yet he gave nothing away. He never boasted, never hinted at it. To any casual observer, he was just a man doing his job, quietly, diligently. The Admiral made a note to himself to learn more about him. Not out of suspicion, but out of curiosity. There was something in this man that didn't fit the simple title of janitor. Something that hinted at a story hidden just beneath the surface. Perhaps it was the way he carried a certain quiet confidence, or the faint scar that ran along his wrist, partially hidden under his sleeve. Whatever it was, it made the Admiral pause and watch for a moment longer than he usually did. For the janitor, none of this mattered. He didn't notice the Admiral. He didn't need to. He had his own routines, his own priorities, and the Admiral's presence was just another part of the night. He was focused on the work, on ensuring everything was ready for the day shift, and on the small sense of accomplishment he got from seeing a job well done. His mind wandered occasionally to his child, imagining their smile, the way they would greet him in the morning, the questions they would ask, the simple joy of sharing a breakfast together. That was the reward he worked for, and it was worth every long, silent hour in the empty corridors. There was a rhythm to his life that he had perfected. Work, home, sleep, repeat. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic, just the steady pace of a man committed to doing right by his child. Yet beneath that calm exterior, there was a depth of experience that few could imagine. He had faced challenges that would have broken most people, had seen situations that would leave lasting marks on anyone. And yet, he carried it lightly, like a quiet shadow always present, never needing acknowledgement. Even when the occasional visitor or officer glanced at him, he never reacted. He gave polite nods, a quiet smile, but nothing more. He didn't want attention. He didn't want recognition. He had learned that what mattered most wasn't who noticed you. It was who you cared for and what you did quietly without expecting applause. That belief shaped everything in his life, from the way he cleaned a floor to the way he prepared a simple dinner at home. Tonight, as he moved through the hallways, there was a slight chill in the air. He adjusted his jacket, kept moving, careful not to slip on the polished floor. His eyes flicked up briefly at the sound of voices in the distance. Officers discussing the day ahead, some laughing quietly, others focused and serious. He didn't interrupt, didn't intrude. He simply moved through, a silent presence in a busy place, unnoticed but somehow essential. The Admiral, observing from a distance, continued to watch. Something about the janitor reminded him of stories he had heard in passing, of operatives who had vanished from public life but left lasting marks in secret operations. There was a familiarity in his stance, a quiet readiness that suggested he knew how to react in a way ordinary people didn't. Yet, he wore it like a cloak of invisibility, blending into his environment. Unassuming and careful. The night continued, the janitor performing his tasks with care and efficiency. He emptied trash cans, wiped down surfaces, swept floors, and adjusted chairs. His movements were precise, deliberate, almost choreographed. Each action had a purpose, each motion a rhythm, and he took satisfaction in doing things well. It was more than cleaning. It was order, discipline, and control in a world that could often feel chaotic. He paused briefly at the end of a long hallway, taking a breath and straightening his posture. There was a quiet pride in what he did, even if no one else noticed. His eyes flicked toward the small office at the end of the hall, where the Admiral was making notes. He didn't acknowledge the man, didn't even glance directly at him. Yet there was a subtle awareness, a recognition that some things were not hidden from him, even if he chose not to react. As the night wore on, the janitor's thoughts drifted to the morning ahead. He would return home, wake his child, and begin the routine of breakfast and school preparations. There was a warmth in that thought, a sense of purpose that fueled him through the long hours. He had chosen this path, and he accepted it with quiet determination. Every mop stroke, every sweep of the broom, every small act of care was part of building a life that mattered, not for himself, but for the one he loved most in the world. By the time he finished his rounds, the facility was spotless. The floors gleamed, the surfaces shone, and everything was in place. He paused, looking around at the order he had created. There was satisfaction in this simple achievement, a sense of peace in knowing that he had done his job well. With a final glance toward the office, where the Admiral still observed, he gathered his things and prepared to leave, ready to return to the small, comforting world of home and family. He walked toward the exit, the quiet click of his shoes echoing lightly in the empty corridor. The lights reflected softly on the polished floor, and he felt a small surge of gratitude for the life he had, despite its challenges. This was his world now, and he carried it with pride, humility, and care. No one else needed to know who he had been or what he had done before this job. What mattered was here, in this moment, in the life he had built with his child. The Admiral watched him leave, curiosity and intrigue growing with each step. He had seen many men in his life, but few carried themselves with such calm certainty. There was something remarkable about this quiet janitor, something that hinted at a life lived in ways most people could not imagine. The Admiral made a mental note to learn more, though he had no idea yet how extraordinary the man before him truly was. As the janitor stepped out into the cold night air, the wind brushing against his face, he pulled his jacket tighter. He didn't look back, didn't think about the Admiral or the facility. His mind was on home, on breakfast, on the small smile that would greet him in the morning. That was the reward he had chosen, the purpose that guided him, and he carried it lightly but firmly, like the steady beat of a drum, marking each step of his life. The next morning, the facility buzzed with activity. Officers moved quickly through hallways, carrying folders and clipboards, speaking in low voices about schedules, inspections, and logistics. There was an undercurrent of anticipation in the air. High-ranking officials rarely visited without purpose, and people were on edge, making sure everything looked perfect. The janitor arrived a little later than usual, having had to get his child ready for school first, but his calm demeanor immediately set him apart from the rushed energy around him. He started his rounds as usual, quietly checking offices, tidying up workspaces, and straightening chairs. He didn't make small talk. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to keep things orderly. People noticed him moving silently, carefully, yet most were too busy to pay him more attention than a passing glance. Some smiled politely as he passed, and he nodded in return, but he didn't linger. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the rhythm of work and the small victories of a clean, organized space. The Admiral had arrived early that morning and was already moving through the building with a small entourage. He had been briefed about the facility, its staff, and the roles everyone played. Yet the janitor caught his attention again. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. There was a spark of intrigue. Something about the man seemed familiar in a way that didn't belong in a janitor's role. The Admiral had seen disciplined men before, but this wasn't discipline alone. There was control, awareness, and an almost invisible authority in the way he moved. The Admiral paused near the end of a hallway and watched the janitor as he adjusted a chair at a conference table. He watched him carefully pick up a small stack of papers that had fallen to the floor, arrange them neatly, and place a pen perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk. It was a small thing, almost insignificant, but it spoke of someone who noticed details others would ignore. The Admiral made a mental note. He had been around enough men to know when something or someone was more than they seemed. Later in the morning, the Admiral called for a brief break. Officers and staff gathered in a side room, some stretching, some sipping coffee, others checking emails. The janitor was there too, quietly cleaning the room, wiping down counters, and arranging chairs. He didn't stop for conversation. He didn't pause to watch the visitors. He had his rhythm, and he followed it. Yet the Admiral, now alone in the room for a moment, decided to speak. He leaned against the doorway and spoke casually, almost joking. "So, you ever serve?" His tone was light, meant to put the staff at ease. It was the kind of small talk a leader might make to appear approachable. Most people laughed politely or shrugged, thinking it was a simple question. But the janitor paused. He didn't look surprised, didn't flinch, but he held his hands on the counter, steady and calm, as if weighing whether to answer. "Ever serve?" The Admiral repeated, raising an eyebrow, this time a little more seriously. There was a faint curiosity in his tone now, but still wrapped in casual words. The janitor glanced at him, his expression unreadable, neither confirming nor denying anything. For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Staff nearby noticed the silence, unsure if they had interrupted something private or if the question had been meant in jest. Finally, the janitor spoke, his voice steady and quiet. "Night Hawk." The words hung in the air, simple, 2 syllables that carried a weight no one else in the room could measure. The staff exchanged glances, confused. Some whispered, "Call sign? What does that mean?" But no one spoke louder. The janitor returned to his work as if nothing had happened, wiping the counter with slow, precise movements, not even acknowledging the murmurs. The Admiral froze. His hand stopped mid-gesture, and he blinked. He had heard the name before once, maybe twice, in classified briefings long ago. He knew the stories whispered among top-level operatives, the tales of men who disappeared from public life and completed missions few could even imagine. And now, a man who had been quietly cleaning the room before him, with no fanfare, no introduction, no title, had just told him he was one of those men. For a moment, the Admiral didn't know what to say. He had spent decades around highly trained operatives, men who had risked their lives countless times. Yet here was one who had chosen to blend in, to vanish into ordinary life. And he had done it so completely that nobody had noticed. The janitor's calm demeanor, his quiet movements, his unassuming nature, all of it was part of a larger truth the Admiral had only just glimpsed. The room remained quiet, though some of the staff had started to notice the change in the Admiral's expression. They didn't understand, but they felt the tension. One of the younger officers whispered something, and the Admiral shook his head, signaling for silence. He didn't want to embarrass the janitor, didn't want to make a scene. The moment was private, and he was suddenly aware that he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. The janitor continued working, methodical and unhurried. There was no need for him to speak again, no need for him to assert who he had been. His presence, his posture, and his calm efficiency spoke volumes to those who could read between the lines. The Admiral, for his part, was silently reviewing the stories he had heard long ago, trying to reconcile them with the man before him, now only a janitor to the casual eye. After a few moments, the Admiral stepped closer, lowering his voice so that no one else could hear. "I didn't expect you." His words were incomplete, but the meaning was clear. The janitor paused, looking up, and for the first time there was a faint recognition in his eyes. Not of surprise, not of fear, but of acknowledgement. He had lived a life where acknowledgement came rarely, and it was enough for him to know that this man understood something. The Admiral hesitated and asked, "Why here? Why this job?" The janitor didn't answer immediately. He returned to his work, slowly wiping down the counter, arranging a few scattered papers, as if the task itself gave him time to think. Then, in a quiet, matter-of-fact tone, he said, "Life changes. This is what matters now." The Admiral looked at him, sensing there was more behind the words than the simple statement suggested. He could see it in the way the man moved, in the quiet strength of his hands, in the discipline that had not left him. This was someone who had once been trained to face impossible situations, to make decisions under pressure, that could change lives in an instant. Yet here he was, choosing the ordinary over the extraordinary, the quiet over the recognition. A few of the staff had started to leave the room, sensing that the conversation was private, but they couldn't help stealing glances back at the janitor. There was something about him that drew attention without effort, something about the calm, the focus, and the quiet confidence that made people pause. They didn't understand it, couldn't articulate it, but they felt it. The Admiral, now standing a few feet away, studied the janitor with new respect. He had been trained to spot talent, to measure courage and discipline, and he could see it in this man, even if no one else could. He also understood that the janitor had chosen a different kind of courage, the courage to step away from danger, to leave behind the accolades, the missions, and the recognition, to take on responsibility that required patience, endurance, and love. The janitor finished his work in the room and quietly packed up his cleaning supplies. He didn't look for praise, didn't expect acknowledgement, but he moved with the same precision he had shown in every task. As he carried the mop and bucket toward the hallway, the Admiral watched him. There was a story in every step, a history in every motion, and a quiet dignity in the way he held himself. Before leaving the room, the Admiral spoke again, his voice softer this time. "Nighthawk, that's a rare call sign." The janitor paused, setting the mop down and glancing briefly at him. There was no pride in his eyes, no boastfulness, just quiet acknowledgement. "It was a long time ago," he said. "This is now." The Admiral nodded, understanding that nothing more needed to be said. The man had left the past behind, but the weight of it was still present in his calm, precise movements. It wasn't a boast. It wasn't a story to share. It was a life, carried with humility and care. As the janitor walked down the hallway toward the exit, the Admiral turned to his aides. "Remember him," he said quietly. "There's more here than meets the eye." The aides looked at each other, unsure what he meant, but they knew better than to question him. The janitor had already disappeared from their sight, blending into the routine of the building like he always did. Outside, the morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. The janitor paused briefly, taking a deep breath. The world was moving fast, full of noise, expectations, and obligations, but he carried his cue. Hewitt rhythm with him. He walked to his car, thinking about home, about the small hands that would reach for his own, about the breakfast that needed making, the homework that needed reviewing. That was his mission now, and he approached it with the same dedication he had once given to far more dangerous tasks. As he drove away, the Admiral watched from a window high in the building. He didn't speak to anyone for a few minutes, lost in thought. He had seen many men in his career, but few left such an impression. This janitor, this single father, carried a weight that most could not imagine, yet he did it without drama, without complaint, without recognition. The Admiral understood that some of the greatest courage wasn't found in battles, medals, or missions. It was found in quiet endurance, in commitment, and in choosing what mattered most every day. And so the janitor returned to his home, to his child, and to the life he had chosen, unaware of the quiet admiration he had earned that morning, or of the stories that would quietly follow him for the rest of his days. The day passed in its usual rhythm, but for the Admiral, nothing felt usual anymore. He had spent decades around elite operatives, men trained to move through danger with calm precision, men whose names appeared only in whispered reports. Yet, he had never expected to meet one who had chosen to disappear entirely into the ordinary world. And now, sitting in his office, reviewing reports and schedules, the words "Nighthawk" kept replaying in his mind. He couldn't shake it. He kept picturing the janitor's steady movements, the calmness in his voice, the quiet dignity in the way he carried himself. He remembered the brief moment when the man had paused after being asked about his service, How he had chosen those 2 words with care, as if they carried everything and nothing at the same time. The Admiral knew better than anyone that call. Signs weren't just names. They were identities forged under pressure, in situations most people would never understand. Nighthawk wasn't a joke, and it wasn't casual. It meant something. By late afternoon, curiosity had grown into a quiet urgency. The Admiral excused himself from meetings and wandered the hallways again, careful not to draw attention. Staff passed him, busy with tasks, unaware of his subtle investigation. He moved methodically, retracing the janitor's path, observing the spaces he had cleaned, the attention to detail, the order that had been left behind. Every corner, every desk, every perfectly aligned chair told a story. There was discipline here, precision, and a level of awareness that went far beyond the ordinary. He found himself in the small storage room where cleaning supplies were kept. The janitor had just finished arranging bottles and mops, as if each item had its exact place, and he moved without haste, almost ceremoniously. The Admiral paused, watching from a distance. He realized that the man had lived a life where every motion mattered, where hesitation could cost lives, where the smallest details could mean the difference between success and failure. And yet, here he was, channeling all of that skill into a humble, unnoticed routine. The janitor glanced up briefly, catching the Admiral's gaze for a fraction of a second. There was no surprise, no anxiety, only recognition. The Admiral felt a shiver of respect run down his spine. This wasn't a man seeking approval, recognition, or admiration. He had carried far heavier burdens, and the weight of them had only made him steady, grounded, and measured. The janitor returned to his work as if nothing had happened, moving with the calm assurance of someone entirely in control of both himself and his environment. The Admiral stepped closer, speaking softly so as not to draw attention from the passing staff. "I didn't know," he said, almost to himself. "I didn't know someone like you could just vanish into ordinary life." The janitor's hands paused briefly on the mop handle. He didn't smile. He didn't shrug. He simply nodded, a small, quiet acknowledgement. "You do what you have to do," he said. "Then you do what matters now." Those words lingered with the Admiral. They were simple, almost plain, but they carried weight. He realized that this man had made a conscious choice, a choice that took courage in a completely different way. He had walked away from danger, from recognition, from a life that could have been celebrated by medals and accolades, and chosen a life of quiet responsibility. He had chosen family, stability, and humility over glory. The Admiral recalled the stories he had heard long ago. He remembered the reports about Nighthawk, missions that were nearly impossible, situations that required split-second decisions under unimaginable pressure. There had been moments when even the most skilled operatives would falter, yet this man had succeeded. And then he had disappeared. Official records barely existed. The details were classified, tucked away in files only the highest-ranking officers could access. For years, he had been a ghost, a legend whispered in corridors of secrecy. And now, he was here, in front of the Admiral, quietly mopping a floor. The contrast was almost unbelievable. It made the Admiral wonder about the life he himself had lived, about the choices he had made, and about the meaning of heroism. He realized that heroism didn't always shout. Sometimes it whispered. Sometimes it lived in the quiet actions of someone who faced the hardest missions, then chose to dedicate themselves to the simplest, most meaningful tasks, caring for family, supporting others, and living with integrity. The rest of the day passed in a blur for the Admiral. Meetings and schedules felt distant, almost irrelevant. His mind kept returning to the janitor, to that single word, Nighthawk. He thought about how the man's child would grow up knowing. A parent who embodied strength, discipline, and quiet courage, even if they never knew the stories behind it. He thought about the sacrifices made, the battles fought in silence, the life lived in service without acknowledgment that late in the afternoon. The Admiral finally found a moment to speak to the janitor alone. He approached the man quietly, stopping just a few feet away. "Why this?" he asked. "Why choose this life instead of staying out there?" The janitor looked at him, calm as ever. He set the mop aside and wiped his hands on a cloth. "Because someone has to be here," he said simply. "And someone has to come home. I made my choice." The Admiral nodded slowly. He could see it in the man's eyes, in the way he held himself, in the quiet certainty that guided every action. This wasn't regret or compromise. This was purpose. He realized that purpose wasn't always about fame, recognition, or even glory. Sometimes, purpose was about presence, about showing up every day for the people who mattered most. The Admiral's respect for him grew. He had met men who craved accolades, who sought recognition, who needed the world to know their value. But this man was different. He had already proven himself in ways that few could ever comprehend, and yet he had chosen humility, responsibility, and love. That took a different kind of strength, one that was rare, often unnoticed, and far more difficult than any mission in the field. As they spoke, a few officers passed by, glancing curiously. The janitor remained composed, acknowledging them with polite nods, but never letting them interrupt the moment. It was as if he had mastered the art of living in two worlds at once. The world of ordinary life and the world of extraordinary experience that few could touch or understand. The Admiral continued to observe him throughout the day. He watched how the janitor moved with quiet confidence, how he maintained order without fanfare, how he approached every small task with care. He noticed the little habits, how he adjusted the chairs, how he lined up papers, how he cleaned surfaces without leaving a smudge. Each action was deliberate, precise, and careful, a reflection of a mind trained to operate under pressure, yet now focused on the ordinary dot. By the time the day ended, the Admiral had made up his mind. He wouldn't make a scene. He wouldn't demand stories or recognition. He would respect the man's choice, his privacy, and the quiet life he had built. But he would remember. He would honor the presence, the discipline, and the courage he had witnessed. Nighthawk wasn't just a call sign. It was a symbol of a life lived with courage, intelligence, and humility. Later, as the janitor prepared to leave, the Admiral approached one last time. "You're making a difference," he said quietly. "Even if nobody else sees it, even if nobody else knows, you're making a difference." The janitor nodded. No words were needed beyond that. He picked up his cleaning supplies and walked toward the exit, his movement steady, precise, and calm. Outside, the sun was low, casting long shadows across the parking lot. The janitor paused for a moment, breathing in the cool air, thinking about home, about the child waiting for him, about the small, meaningful victories of the day. The Admiral watched him go, a sense of admiration and respect settling deep within him. He realized that the greatest acts of courage weren't always the ones written in reports or celebrated in ceremonies. Sometimes the greatest courage was shown in quiet ways, in choices made without fanfare, and in living a life with purpose, integrity, and love. And so, Nighthawk disappeared once again into the ordinary world, carrying with him the weight of experiences no one could imagine, yet living each day with quiet strength and unwavering focus. The Admiral returned to his office, changed in a subtle but profound way, carrying the lesson that heroism could take many forms, and that sometimes the most extraordinary people were the ones you least expected to notice. The next few days passed quietly at the facility. Life went on as usual. Officers prepared reports, schedules were adjusted, and the janitor moved through his routines, unnoticed by most. Yet for the Admiral, nothing felt usual. The moment he had learned the janitor's call sign, the image of Nighthawk had settled firmly in his mind. Every time he passed the man in the hallway, he felt a mix of respect, curiosity, and a desire to understand the choices that had led him here. Finally, one afternoon, the Admiral found himself alone in the janitor's usual corridor. Most of the staff were busy in meetings or errands, leaving the space quiet, almost eerily so. The Admiral approached slowly, careful not to startle the janitor, who was moving with the familiar calm precision that had already earned him a quiet admiration. The janitor glanced up briefly as he wiped a counter, his expression neutral, as if he already knew someone would be approaching. "I wanted to ask," the Admiral began, keeping his voice low, "why you chose this path, after everything you've done." The janitor paused, setting the cleaning cloth down and leaning slightly on the counter. He looked at the Admiral, calm and measured, as if considering how much to reveal. He didn't speak immediately. Silence stretched between them, not awkward, but deliberate, filled with unspoken understanding. Why leave it all behind? The Admiral repeated softly. The missions, the recognition, the life most people would risk anything to have. Why this? The janitor finally answered, in the same quiet, matter-of-fact tone that had marked every interaction so far. Because some battles aren't worth continuing. Some victories aren't worth the cost if you lose yourself in the process. He paused, letting the words hang. I chose life. I chose responsibility. I chose the people who depend on me every day over the ones who only expect me to risk everything for a mission. The Admiral listened carefully. He had heard men speak of sacrifice, of duty, of loyalty, but these words had a depth that went beyond any mission briefing or military speech. There was a clarity, a wisdom that came from living with consequences few could imagine. The janitor wasn't defending himself or seeking approval. He was simply stating a truth he had already accepted, that life had changed, and he had adapted to serve it differently. You mean your child, the Admiral said quietly. Almost as an afterthought, the janitor nodded, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugging at his lips. Exactly. Everything else, it's secondary. The child is my mission now. The rest is just noise. There was a weight in his words that struck the Admiral deeply. In the field, he had seen men dedicate themselves to causes larger than life, to duty, to country, to honor. Yet here was someone who had dedicated himself fully to another kind of mission, one no one would celebrate, one no one would understand unless they lived it themselves. He realized that courage wasn't only measured by risking your life on a battlefield. It was measured by showing up every day, by being consistent, by choosing the hard path that meant love, responsibility, and quiet endurance. The Admiral thought of the countless men and women he had served with, many of whom had sought recognition, medals, and fame. And yet, here was someone who had achieved more than most, who had faced dangers beyond imagination, who had walked away without a single complaint or desire for acknowledgement. That, the Admiral decided, required an even rarer kind of courage. They stood in silence for a few moments, the sounds of the facility muted around them. The janitor had returned to his work, but his movements had slowed slightly, deliberate pauses that made it clear he was allowing the Admiral to speak without interruption. The Admiral considered how carefully the man lived, how every action was measured, every choice intentional. He understood that the janitor's calm demeanor was not emptiness, but control. It was experience distilled into simplicity. Do you ever miss it? The Admiral asked quietly. The missions, the intensity, the purpose you felt out there? The janitor paused, looking thoughtful. Sometimes, he admitted softly, but purpose isn't something you only find in danger. You find it where you're needed the most. And right now, that's here, at home, raising a child. That's my purpose now. The Admiral nodded slowly. He could sense the weight of the decision, the magnitude of the choice. For someone who had been trained to live on the edge, to face impossible odds, to make split-second decisions, to step into chaos without hesitation choosing quiet, ordinary life required discipline of a different kind. It required humility, patience, and self-awareness. It required courage, the kind that few recognized. You know, the Admiral said after a pause, most people would never believe that a man like you could walk away from everything and just become a janitor. They wouldn't understand the strength it takes. The janitor shrugged lightly. They don't need to. I don't need their understanding. What matters is doing what's right for the life I have now. I was trained to serve, and I still do. Just differently. The Admiral studied him, realizing that these were not just words. Every movement, every breath, every calm expression carried the authenticity of experience. This man had been forged in extreme conditions, tempered by pressure, and yet he had emerged choosing a path few would comprehend. He had chosen responsibility over recognition, love over glory, humility over fame. You're remarkable, the Admiral said quietly, almost reverently. I've known a lot of people who would never have that clarity. Most would cling to the past, the missions, the adrenaline. But you've made a choice that only a few could ever make. The janitor shook his head, smiling faintly. It's not remarkable. It's necessary. I made mistakes before, lost people before, and I realized that some things are permanent and some things aren't. The missions, the danger, they weren't permanent. But the child, the home, the life I can influence, that is permanent. That's why I'm here. There was a softness in his voice, a human warmth that contrasted with the steely discipline he carried in every other aspect of life. The Admiral understood then that this was not someone who had surrendered. This was someone who had chosen wisely. This was not failure, not hiding, not retreat. It was wisdom, discipline, and love expressed through the quietest, most consistent acts imaginable. For a moment, the Admiral thought about what it meant to lead. He had commanded men who followed orders without hesitation, who risked everything on missions no one would ever know about. He had seen courage in its rawest, most public form. And yet, here was someone who demonstrated courage quietly, consistently, in a way that touched lives without fanfare, without recognition, and without applause. That was something he had rarely witnessed, and something he would never forget. The janitor straightened a stack of papers, then leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. Most people measure service in terms of danger or visibility, he said. But service is whatever you do that makes a difference. Sometimes that difference is small, quiet, unnoticed. But it's real. The Admiral nodded, reflecting on his own life, his own missions, and the ways he had measured success. He realized that the man before him had redefined what it meant to serve. It wasn't about accolades or recognition. It was about showing up, doing your best, and being consistent. It was about love, responsibility, and quiet endurance. I see that now, the Admiral said softly. And I respect it, more than I can put into words. The janitor simply nodded. He returned to his work, finishing the few remaining tasks in the corridor with steady, deliberate movements. There was no need for further conversation. The Admiral understood. Words were not required. The man had spoken through action, through presence, and through the simple, profound choices that defined his life. As the day drew to a close, the janitor packed up his cleaning supplies. The Admiral lingered for a moment, watching him move with calm precision. Every step, every motion, every pause carried meaning, discipline, and quiet strength. He realized that some people could teach lessons without speaking, without drawing attention, without seeking recognition. They taught by living. And Nighthawk, the man he had briefly glimpsed beyond the janitor's uniform, was teaching one of the most important lessons of all. Courage comes in many forms. And sometimes, the hardest battles are the ones fought quietly. Without notice, the janitor walked toward the exit, his mop and bucket in hand, the fading light casting long shadows across the floor. He paused for a moment at the door, breathing in the cool evening air. He thought about home, about the small hands that would reach for him, about the warm smile waiting at the kitchen table. That was his reward. That was the mission he had chosen. The Admiral watched him leave from a nearby window, the weight of the moment settling deep in his mind. He understood now that heroism was not always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it was quiet, steadfast, and invisible. Sometimes it lived in the choices we make when no one is watching, in the people we care for, and in the integrity with which we live. Nighthawk had chosen that life, and in doing so, had redefined what courage and service truly meant. As the janitor drove home that evening, the Admiral returned to his office. Silent, reflective, and forever changed. He would carry this encounter with him, not as a story to share, not as a medal to honor, but as a reminder that the truest strength often lives in quiet, unnoticed ways. And that sometimes the ordinary. World hides extraordinary people, walking among us with humility, discipline, and courage. The next morning, the facility hummed with its usual activity, but something had subtly shifted in the atmosphere. It wasn't obvious to most of the staff. Officers continued with reports, meetings carried on as scheduled, and the janitor moved through the hallways with the same calm, methodical pace he always had. Yet for the Admiral, the presence of Nighthawk, or the janitor, as everyone else called him, was more than a passing curiosity. It was a quiet reminder, a lesson he carried with him like a compass he hadn't realized he needed. The Admiral found himself observing the janitor throughout the day. There was a rhythm to his movements, a precision in the way he worked, a subtle discipline that spoke of a life far beyond the ordinary. Each time he passed by, his mind revisited the conversation they had shared, the words about choosing life over missions, responsibility over recognition, love over glory. It was a philosophy that seemed so simple, yet it carried layers of wisdom that only experience could provide. At lunchtime, the Admiral lingered in his office, looking out the window at the janitor walking across the parking lot. He remembered the small details, the way he carried the mop and bucket, the slight adjustment of his posture, the careful, unhurried steps. Those details, the Admiral realized, revealed a lifetime of training, experience, and resilience. Nighthawk had learned to survive impossible odds, to make critical decisions under extreme pressure, and yet here he was, choosing to pour all that focus into ordinary life. There was courage in that, perhaps more than most would ever recognize. The Admiral picked up a file he had been reviewing earlier, but he couldn't focus. Every line of text blurred as his mind replayed the encounter with the janitor. He thought about the small victories in life, showing up for someone every day, keeping promises, caring for those who depend on you. These were not the kind of achievements that made headlines, but they were no less significant. In fact, he realized they were harder in some ways, because they demanded consistency, patience, and humility. Late in the afternoon, the Admiral found himself walking down the corridor once more, seemingly by chance. The janitor was there, adjusting a chair in a small meeting room. Their eyes met briefly, and the janitor gave a subtle nod. No words were exchanged, none were needed, but it was a moment of mutual understanding. The Admiral appreciated that he didn't need to make the man explain himself. He had already seen the evidence in every deliberate movement, every measured action, every quiet interaction. Nighthawk had lived his truth, and that was enough. The Admiral's thoughts turned inward. He considered his own life, the missions he had commanded, the people he had trained, the dangers he had faced. He realized that courage was not only about facing external threats. Sometimes the most challenging battles were internal the battles of patience, responsibility, and commitment. And Nighthawk had mastered that battle in a way he had rarely seen. The janitor's choice to leave the chaos behind, to focus on family and small daily responsibilities, was a testament to a deeper kind of strength. As the day drew to a close, the Admiral decided to do something he had not done before. He walked to the janitor quietly, waiting until the corridor was empty. "I want to say something," he began, his voice soft but steady. "I've seen a lot in my life. I've met extraordinary people, faced impossible situations, and commanded men who risked everything. But what you do, how you live, the choices you make, it's extraordinary in a different way." The janitor paused, leaning slightly on his mop, his expression calm. He didn't look surprised, nor did he seek praise. He simply waited, allowing the Admiral to continue. "You've chosen to focus on the things that truly matter," the Admiral said. "Family, responsibility, integrity. The quiet victories that go unseen. That takes courage. More than I can say." The janitor nodded, a faint smile appearing at the corner of his lips. "I'm not seeking recognition," he said quietly. "I just do what I need to do. That's all." The Admiral considered that. He realized that this was a man who had mastered humility, self-discipline, and the art of presence. He had walked away from fame and danger, from the missions that could have defined his legacy in the public eye, and instead created a life of lasting impact in the private sphere. That, the Admiral thought, was a kind of heroism that few would ever understand, but it was heroism all the same. As the janitor finished tidying the room, the Admiral lingered in the hallway. He thought about the lessons he had learned in the past few days. He had spent years evaluating courage, skill, and achievement, often measuring them by visible outcomes, medals, reports, success in missions. But Nighthawk had shown him that the true measure of a person's character was not always what was visible. It was the consistency, the choices, and the quiet ways in which one commits to making a difference. The janitor packed up his supplies and started toward the exit. The Admiral followed him a short distance, not to intrude, but simply to observe. Every step, every motion, was deliberate, precise, and calm. He saw the care with which the janitor carried out even the smallest task, and it reminded him that greatness did not always announce itself. Sometimes it lived in the quiet corners of life, in everyday acts of responsibility and love. Outside, the sun was low in the sky, casting warm, golden light across the parking lot. The janitor paused for a moment, taking a deep breath as he prepared to head home. His child would be waiting, hungry for a story, a meal, or simply the presence of a parent who was fully there. That was his mission. Now the mission that mattered more than any battle he had ever fought. The Admiral watched him, silently acknowledging the profound dedication it took to choose this life. As the janitor drove away, the Admiral returned to his office. He sat at his desk, reviewing the reports before him, but his mind kept drifting back to the lessons of the past days. He thought about the lives he had touched, the missions he had led, and the men he had trained. And he realized that there were different kinds of service, different kinds of courage, and different kinds of victory. Some were loud and celebrated. Others were quiet and unseen, but no less significant. Later that evening, the Admiral found himself reflecting on his own approach to leadership. He had always measured success by outcomes, results, and recognition. But Nighthawk had taught him that the true essence of service was about showing up, doing one's best, and making a difference in ways that mattered most. Sometimes that meant risking life in a battlefield. Sometimes it meant showing up for a child, or completing a small task with care, or maintaining integrity when no one was watching. The Admiral realized he had learned more from the janitor in those few days than he had from decades of formal training and experience. Nighthawk had shown him that heroism was not a one-size-fits-all concept. It could be loud or quiet, dramatic or subtle, visible or unseen. What mattered was the heart, the integrity, and the dedication behind every action. A few days later, the Admiral saw the janitor in the hallway again. Their eyes met, and the janitor gave a faint nod of acknowledgement. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The Admiral understood. Nighthawk had chosen his life, his path, and his mission, and he had done so with quiet courage, humility, and wisdom. The Admiral returned to his office, feeling a sense of calm. He realized that life was full of extraordinary people who might appear ordinary at first glance. The janitor, the man he now knew as Nighthawk, had taught him that greatness often lived in simplicity, in consistency, and in the quiet acts of dedication that shaped the lives of others. He knew he would never forget this lesson. It would influence the way he observed, the way he led, and the way he understood heroism in the days to come. As weeks passed, the janitor continued his work with the same calm precision, unnoticed by most, but fully seen by the Admiral. He moved through life with a quiet confidence, balancing responsibilities, caring for his child, and maintaining the steady rhythm that had become his trademark. The Admiral occasionally observed him, silently acknowledging the lessons he had learned about courage, service, and integrity. It became clear that Nighthawk's presence had left a lasting impact, not through words or accolades, but through the example he set every day. He had chosen the path that mattered most to him, and in doing so, had redefined what it meant to be brave, responsible, and heroic. He was a reminder that ordinary life could hold extraordinary meaning when approached with dedication, humility, and love. The Admiral often reflected on those moments, remembering the calm voice, the deliberate movements, and the simple but profound statements about life, purpose, and responsibility. Nighthawk had shown him that sometimes the most important missions were not fought on battlefields, but in living a life of integrity, care, and quiet commitment. That lesson would stay with the Admiral forever, shaping the way he approached leadership, decisions, and the way he saw the people around him. And so, Nighthawk continued, blending seamlessly into everyday life, carrying with him the weight of his past experiences, the discipline of his training, and the love and responsibility for his child. No one noticed the extraordinary man behind the mop and bucket. No one applauded the quiet heroism he displayed every day. Yet those who knew understood, and those who truly paid attention, like the Admiral, carried the knowledge of his greatness quietly in their hearts. The janitor's life went on, modest and steady, full of small victories that mattered far more than any public recognition. And in the Admiral's mind, the story of Nighthawk would always remain a powerful reminder that courage is not only measured by dramatic acts or celebrated victories, but also by the choices we make, the lives we care for, and the quiet integrity with which we live every single day. The ordinary world hid extraordinary people. Nighthawk was one of them, and the world, whether it realized it or not, was better for it.